As we begin our conversations around transformation and change, and we'll be walking through the Gospel of John over the next 8 weeks or so. And we begin with this story from the second chapter of John, the first of Jesus' signs. And it is a sign that anticipates all of the transformation that is going to happen in individuals' lives, in the lives of the disciples, in the lives and in the systems of the nation that Jesus ministers in. It is the beginning, and it is a foretaste of what is about to happen. Now, I love this story for a number of reasons, and I just want to call attention to a couple of details in it. First of all, in John's Gospel, this is our first encounter with Mary. Like in John's Gospel, there's no shepherds, there's no annunciation, there's no angel Gabriel, there's no magi, there's no shepherds, there's none of that. John starts out, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and God made all things through this Word, and nothing that was made without it. And then he goes into John the Baptist, and then Jesus is baptized and calls his disciples, and boom, here we are in Cana of Galilee. And they're at a wedding. And Mary's not even named by name. She's just the mother of Jesus, right? She doesn't even have a name in this text. First time we encounter her, we don't even know what her name is. And she's kind of the protagonist, really, at the beginning of the story. Because they're at a wine, and, terrible thing. There's no more wine at the wedding. What a travesty. I mean, the celebration is about to go straight into the ditch, right? Because there's no more wine. And Mary, like most women who pay attention to these kind of details while the men are oblivious, says, "Hey, Jesus, the wine ran out." And Jesus says, "And what? What are you telling me?" And like a good mother who kicks her children in the behind to get them to do the things that they really should be doing, Mary gives Jesus a little kick in the butt and says, "It's your time. Not my time, it's your time. Y'all, do what he says." And she thrusts Jesus into this first moment. You get the sense that Jesus is just kind of like not ready for it yet. And yet, once nudged by his mom, he discovers, okay, it's time. Now, in this house, or place of celebration, wherever it is, there were large jars made of stone for the purification rites that were part of Jewish life. Now, an interesting detail, not this last trip that I took to Israel, but the first trip I took, we went to Cana of Galilee. And we went to the church that commemorates this sign. And near that church, in an archaeological excavation, they found the remnants of a stone jar that would have been the size, when it was all its full height, it would have been the size of a jar like the ones that Jesus is talking about, or that this story talks about today. 30 gallons of wine, 30 gallons of water initially. And it's a stone jar, and that's an interesting detail because any receptacle that was used to hold water for purification could not be made of clay. It had to be made of stone. Because God makes stone, people make clay. And you can't use an object to purify something if it has been tainted by humanity. So stone jars made of something that God created are the jars that hold the water for purification. Now, if you don't know this about Judaism, you miss some important details in this story. Because what Jesus is about to do is he's about to do a sign that says all this purification stuff is going out the window with me. Because you see, the purification rites, all of the rituals of purification, the purity codes of Judaism, from all the way back to Leviticus, were created with the intention of keeping things that were clean away from things that were unclean. And if you managed to get unclean, then there were rituals, including the washing by water from a jar like this, that would enable you to be clean again and come back into the world of the clean. And the temple was the center of this purification system, this purity code system. The tabernacle in the days of Moses was the place where that was centered. And then when the first temple was built, it took the form of the tabernacle, and then the second temple took the form of the first temple. And I want to remind you, I've talked to you a little bit about this before, but I want to remind you how the temple, in its architecture, manifests this whole mentality of the purity code, of keeping the holy apart from the unholy, the clean apart from the unclean. See, this is a slide of a model of the second temple and the court of the second temple. This is the Temple Mount, and that giant rectangle is the whole court of the Temple Mount. To get an idea how big that is, you see how many of those columns there are all the way around? Each one of those columns is big enough that it took 3 Roman soldiers holding hands to go around the perimeter of that piece. So each one of those columns was ginormous in size. Now, whoa, hang on. The middle part, the middle section, is a successive set of rectangles or squares. And I'm going to go through each of those so you can see how this functioned in the life of the Jewish people. That exterior court, that big space around the outside, was called the court of the Gentiles. And anyone from any nation could come that close to God. But that's it. If you tried to go inside that inner rectangle where the taller portion is, it was on pain of death. And the temple guard were there to ensure it. So if you were a non-Jew, you could only get so close. All right, next slide. Now this is that center part, only I've turned it on its side, okay? So it was like this in the other picture, now it's sideways. On the right-hand side, where that kind of crisscross is, that's called the court of the women. That's how close women who were Jews could get. They could come into that space. But that black dividing wall right there, don't even think about going past that. Because you're not clean enough to do that. Because, you have a monthly cycle that makes you unclean on a regular, right? After that wall, that little blue section, that's as far as Jewish men could go. Beyond that space was the habitation only of male priests who were Jews. And they were only able to go into the sanctuary, the longer rectangle that has the forum there. That's where the table of showing, the show table and the candelabras were. And then in the sanctuary, the priests could go, but in that center area of blue, in the middle of the big black rectangle, the Holy of Holies, only one priest, only one day out of the year, the high priest could go in that temple, into that Holy of Holies. and only after an extremely elaborate ritual of cleansing, washing, and purification. The whole system was set up to let you in only so far based on how clean you were. And in this story we have before us today, Jesus takes a symbol of that whole system, these jugs, these stone containers full of water, and he says, just wait. This is water now, but it's going to be wine. They fill them with water. You can't carry those things. Imagine how much a stone container like that would weigh. They stay in place. Water is brought in, they're filled up, and then he says, take some of this water to the steward. And by the time it gets to the steward, it's no longer water, but it's wine. And not just any wine. It's like the good stuff, right? You know? And I love the little detail where he says to the bridegroom, you're supposed to serve the good wine first. And then when people get wasted, that's when you serve the wine that's cheap, right? You know, you just don't serve them the good wine when they can't even taste it because they're so far gone. All of which is intended to say Jesus is about to bring the good stuff. Jesus is about to bring the good stuff that takes away the purity codes that limit who can and who can't. And we're going to see in John's gospel over and over and over and over again the way in which he tears down that system. And he tears it down through love and justice. Love is the way we tear it down on a person-to-person basis. By embracing you in love, I make you part of my kin, right? My people. I break down the barrier that could keep you away. But as a society, we have to break those barriers down, not just through love, but through justice, which is the systemic way in which we change systems that separate people into categories that don't mix with one another. So what does all that mean for us today? Well, we think we don't live in a time with purity codes, but we do. And we have. In fact, in San Antonio, for many, 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 many years, by law, by city code, some neighborhoods were only for Mexicanos, and some neighborhoods were only for blacks, and the best neighborhoods were for the white people. By law. If you were black and wanted to buy a house in one of those white neighborhoods, the owner of that house was prohibited by law in the deed of that property from selling you that home. By law. As I shared this in the Spanish service, Tirso came up to me afterwards and said, that happened to me. The first house I attempted to buy in San Antonio, they told me I could not buy because I was Mexican. Those laws stayed in place, and then on top of them were layered practices and policies by the banking world that refused to give loans to families that lived in those neighborhoods of color. And what was the effect of that purity code? The effect of that purity code was that when Mexicano families or black families that wanted to repair their homes or build up their homes or expand their homes so that their home would increase in value and they would be able to pass on greater wealth to their children, those families were utterly unable to do that because they had no access to loan income to be able to do the repairs that they needed or the expansion that they needed. And so what happens to the housing values in those neighborhoods? They don't go up, they go down and down and down and down. And so these families of color are never able to build any wealth generationally, like the gringos on the north. And then when you set up a school system that is based on property value, what happens? Because of this San Antonio purity code, the schools for the neighborhoods of color have to tax the poorer citizens at a higher rate to raise less money for the schools for their kids. While the gringos in the north pay less tax percentage-wise on their homes, which are of much greater value, and they raise more money to educate their children. That is a contemporary purity code. And it is one that San Antonio is still paying the price for today. Because all of those neighborhoods that had those historic deed restrictions and those historic experiences of not being allowed access to capital to repair and upgrade their homes are the communities that are deeply, deeply impoverished today. So if you think we don't live in a purity code system in our day and time, we still do. And the challenge of Jesus' sign to take the water of the purity code system and turn it into the very best wine is the challenge to you and to me and to us together to love in ways that break down those barriers and to do the work of justice today that breaks down those systems so that all can experience the gifts of God's abundance, not just some. So as we walk through the stories of transformation over the course of these next weeks, I hope that you will hear the echo of this first sign that Jesus did in Cana of Galilee. And remember that every one of those moments of transformation is an invitation from Jesus to turn water into wine. Let us pray. Lord, thank you for the way in which Jesus challenges us from the very start to see with greater clarity the things that exclude and to walk with greater courage into the wine-making world of the gospel. Give us the grace to love expansively and to do the hard work of advocacy, that our communities and that our lives may know the full abundance that you desire to pour out upon us like good wine. In your name we pray. Amen. looks like it's okay, but it's going off.
Silver?
Silver.
David's what?
Got it. There we go. Got it.
David,
Got it.
David already went.
Got it. It's a little hard to sing.